Hey everyone, thank you for tuning in. I hope that this webinar can provide a short break from studying for finals and help get you excited to leave for your program abroad. My name is Kendall and I am an Education Abroad Peer Ambassador. I studied abroad last spring semester with ISA in Malaga, Spain, where I completed an intensive Spanish language program. Just so you all are aware, this presentation will be fairly Europe heavy as we send a majority of our students to European countries. A lot of the research required and processes, however, will be the same for any country. If your program is outside of Europe, most of this information will still be applicable to what you can expect. We'll discuss some differences and provide some specific resources for different regions of the world towards the end. Also, be on the lookout for more information about the other two webinars we'll be hosting next week. These will include packing and budgeting abroad, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. We've worked to design these webinars to address some of the most common questions we receive from students, as well as to provide information and resources we wish we would have known ahead of time or found useful during our time abroad. During this webinar, hopefully in about 30 minutes or less, I'll be talking specifically about everything you need to know related to traveling while you're abroad. I'll begin by discussing how to navigate the airports and how to get to your host country. This will include topics like check-in, baggage, security, immigration, customs, arriving abroad, and jet lag. I'll also talk about how to navigate your host city and its local transportation. I'll show you how to go about traveling abroad while you're abroad and how to plan a successful weekend trip. And I'll end with some helpful resources and final tips. Also, most of the information I'll be giving you will be through what I say and not what's on the slides, so it may be helpful to take some notes. So without further ado, let's get started. I want to preface by saying, please don't freak out. I realize that it sounds like we'll be covering a lot of information, and you're right, we will be. This webinar, however, is designed to provide you with resources and knowledge to use while you're abroad, not to give you an exhaustive list of all the things you need to do before you leave. Keep in mind, too, that there's not really one right way to do the things we'll discuss. You figure out a lot of this as you go and learn a lot about yourself along the way. This is just to give you a little heads up. So relax, take a deep breath, and get excited. So we'll start by talking about traveling to your host country and how to navigate airports. If you've previously been abroad, some of this might be a review. If you haven't, I'll try to cover most of what you'll experience. Trust me, it's not as scary as it may seem. So on the day of your flight out of the US, when you should check in, as well as the time you should arrive at the airport, really depends on the airport, the airline, and your route. So I would highly recommend checking the times listed by the airline with which your tickets are booked. In general, though, you can often check in for your flight 24 hours in advance. Additionally, if the first flight of your route is a domestic flight, for example, from Lexington to Detroit and Detroit to Prague, you should arrive at the airport no later than 45 minutes prior to the scheduled departure time. However, I generally prefer erring on the side of caution and arrive at least an hour in advance. You won't have to recheck your bags upon arrival in Detroit, however, as they will automatically be transferred to your final destination. If you're flying directly to an international location, for example, from Atlanta to Madrid, you should arrive at least 2.5 hours in advance. Keep in mind that if you're departing from a busier airport, such as Atlanta or Chicago, you may want to allow yourself more time for long check-in or security lines. You will also need to have your passport readily available at check-in. Most international flights usually include one free bag and have higher weight limits. The number of bags, as well as the weight of bags allowed, however, will depend on your airline, so check those while you're packing to avoid any unexpected baggage fees. They can be expensive, but are mostly avoidable if you do your research ahead of time. Security is more or less the same at every airport in the US. You should have your boarding pass and passport out and ready to be handed to the TSA security agent before you go through screening. You're allowed to bring a 1 quart-sized plastic bag full of liquids that are no larger than 3.4 ounces each. You should have these, as well as any prescription medications and laptops or tablets readily available to be taken out of your bag and placed in a separate bin when you go through the screening. You will also likely be required to remove your shoes, belts, and anything that's inside your pockets before going through the detector. Be sure to pack any sharp objects such as razors, nail clippers, or scissors in checked bags, as they will not be allowed through security. You can find a full list of what you're allowed to bring in your carry-on luggage on TSA's website. TSA also has an Instagram account that answers travelers' questions about more specific items. Once you arrive at your final destination, you will be ushered from your gate to immigration and customs. In most places, these are combined into one unit, but they are technically different. Immigration seeks to monitor who is coming and going. First, the immigration agent will look at your documents, including your passport and visa, and will likely ask you some questions about why you're entering that country or how long you're staying. They may also ask to look at documentation that proves you'll be a student, in which case you would provide them documents showing your program details, dates, and university acceptance letter. You may also want to have your return itinerary or tickets available. Once you've cleared immigration and your passport has been stamped, you will then have to clear customs, where they seek to control items being brought into the country. Before your flight lands abroad, you may be asked to fill out a customs declaration form for which you'll either have nothing to declare or you will have something to declare. Declarable items include perishable food such as fresh produce, meat or cheese, animals, plants, or large amounts of cigarettes, alcohol, or cash. Customs agents will collect these cards as you go through customs. Don't be alarmed if they request to look inside your baggage. I think it's also important to at least mention jet lag, as most international flights go through the night and land abroad very early in the morning. My flight to Spain left Atlanta around 5 in the evening and landed in Madrid at about 6 a.m. This won't be the same for Australia or Asian countries. If you're studying in either of those two regions, you'll experience an even greater time change. If you're studying somewhere in South America, you may not experience a time change at all, or it may be just a few hours. Here's a short video to show you how to best combat jet lag.
How to avoid jet lag. You don't have to accept fatigue and sleeplessness as the cost of traveling to distant lands. There are half a dozen things you can do to lessen the impact of crossing time zones. You will need comfortable clothing for the flight, plenty of water, and a pair of sunglasses. Step 1. Prepare your body for the new time zone by adjusting your schedule an hour or two earlier or later in the days just before the trip. Step 2. About 4 days before your trip, consume less fat, salt, caffeine, and sugar, and more fresh fruits and vegetables. Travelers on a typical American diet, protein-heavy breakfasts, high-carb dinners, tend to have a harder time sleeping at their destinations. Step 3. If at all possible, try to fly west instead of east. It's easier for the body to extend the day than to shorten, so traveling west is easier to adjust to. Step 4. Set your watch as soon as you board the plane for your destination's time zone. Try to pretend that it's already that time and act accordingly. If it's the middle of the night in your destination, try to fall asleep as soon as possible. Step 5. Wear comfortable clothing on the plane. Tight clothing will reduce circulation and cause discomfort, interfering with your ability to sleep. Step 6. Don't consume any caffeine or alcohol in flight. They'll just dehydrate you and disrupt your sleep patterns. Drink lots of water instead. Get up at least once every 2 hours to walk around. This will improve your circulation and reduce muscle stiffness. Step 7. Wear sunglasses during the last few hours of an overnight flight and for the first several hours after getting off the plane. Researchers have found that this helps people adjust their body clocks by altering their light patterns. Step 8. Resist the urge to nap upon arrival. Instead, try to get some exercise and some exposure to sunlight to stave off sleep until your normal bedtime. Did you know? Hamsters who were given a shot of Viagra adjusted to a new time zone 20 to 50% faster than a control group, raising the possibility of the drug someday being prescribed for air travelers.
So now you're finally in your host city, but how do you get from your host home to your university or from your dorm to the city center? This will really depend on your host city. Larger cities will likely have more developed public transportation systems, such as metros or trams. Smaller cities, on the other hand, may just offer buses, and in some cases, most of the locals will walk everywhere. Ask other students, your host family, or even the locals to see what the most commonly used mode of transportation is. If you are on a UK partner program, the on-site staff will likely have recommendations. Also, keep in mind how much you'll be using the public transportation and do some cost comparing. For example, if your host home is located outside the city center, but your university is located in the city center, you may need to commute by bus, tram, or metro each morning. If that's the case, it may be more cost efficient to buy a monthly pass or ticket rather than to buy a new pass or ticket each day. Maybe you'll be living in the dorms and you just have a 2-minute walk to class. Unless you anticipate needing to use the public transportation often, it will probably be cheaper to just purchase a one-day pass whenever you need to use it. Don't forget to check for student rates, as they will likely be cheaper if they are offered. If you're just traveling within your city and there's a tram, metro, or local train, the easiest place to buy tickets will probably be at the stations through kiosks located at the entrances. For bus passes, you can generally either buy a ticket at the bus stop or just pay the bus driver the price to ride at one time. Just an FYI, make sure you have some cash on you when purchasing these tickets or passes. Most kiosks won't take cards, and bus drivers definitely won't. In fact, it would be best for you to have exact fare because change normally isn't given. Just as an example, in Malaga, I had to take the bus to school every day, so I purchased a 3-month student pass from the central office of the local bus service. I was able to use this every time I got on a bus that service stops in Malaga. My friends that didn't have this pass just paid the bus driver €130 each time they got onto the bus. This again will depend on your city, so try to do some research and ask around to figure out the most convenient, affordable way to navigate using the local transportation. In some cities, you'll be required to validate your pass or ticket. This just means that it needs to be stamped at a ticket machine or immediately after boarding with the date and time and proves that you've paid appropriately. Officials will conduct random inspections, and if you're caught without a validated ticket, you may be subject to a pretty hefty fine. Additionally, know that for bus or tram systems, you will likely need to ring a bell, push a button, or pull a lever to notify the driver that you want to get off at the next stop. If you don't, and there's nobody else on the bus that wants to get off at that stop, the bus driver probably won't stop. Subways, trains, or metros, on the other hand, should stop automatically at every station. The schedules for these modes of transportation can be found online, but generally speaking, in most places, a metro or bus stops at each station fairly frequently. In some cities, it may be every 5 minutes, and others, it may be every 20 or 30 minutes. You just need to be aware of these and make plans accordingly. Some cities even have apps for their public transportation systems where you can find the hourly schedules. These may also be helpful in figuring out how to get to a desired location. Keep in mind, you can also just use Google Maps. While you're on Wi-Fi, you can search and download the route so that it will be available to you while you're en route without Wi-Fi or data. Be aware that strikes may occur on public transportation. This basically means that the employees of that company are protesting against something by not coming to work, and it may interrupt your travel plans. Pay attention to local media so that you can make alternate plans. This is larger than a local level, but while I was abroad in Spain, the French air traffic controllers went on strike for 5 days. This meant that the French airspace was also shut down, or in other words, no planes could fly through the French airspace. One of my friends was in Ireland at the time and was trying to get back to Spain. Her flight was canceled and she ended up having to fly to Portugal and then take an overnight bus back to Spain instead. Locally, this could occur on any of the public transportation, and paying attention to these things will help you find an alternate plan ahead of time. Metro or tram maps can be intimidating at first, but once you know what you're looking for, you can pretty much navigate them for any city. So we'll use the Metro map for Rome, Italy as an example. And I'm going to get a little spotlight out so I can show you guys as I work through this. So let's say we want to go from the San Paolo Basilica to the Colosseum. First, we need to figure out which line we need to take. We can see on the map that there are stops called Basilica, San Paolo, and Colosseo, both on the B line, which is the blue line on the map. So we have the Basilica, San Paolo right here, and the Colosseo. So these are both on this blue route, which is the B line. Next, we need to figure out which platform to take, which basically means we need to make sure we get on the metro going in the right direction. These platforms are named by the last stop of the line in that direction. So if we wanted to go north on this line, we would take the B line towards Rebibbia, which is the last stop on this line. If we want to go south, we would take the B line towards Laurentina. So that is Laurentina on this line, the last stop. In this case, we want to go north since we're leaving San Paolo Basilica to go to the Colosseum. So we would take the B line towards Revivia. Finally, each white dot along the line represents a metro stop, so it looks like we'll get off on the third stop for the Colosseum. So we see 1, 2, 1, 2, and then 3. Most metros will have signs inside the cabin signifying the next stop, and you'll also see signs outside the metro that say the name of that stop. In some cases, you might have to ride multiple metros to reach your desired destination. This will require you to ride one metro to the stop where the two lines cross, then you will take a different metro to continue your journey. For example, say you are at the Valle Aurelia stop on the A line right here, and you want to reach the Revivia stop on the B line, which is over here. You would first get on the platform for the A line towards Anagnina, so we're going the A line towards Anagnina, which is right here, and ride through approximately 8 stops until you reach the Termini stop, where the A line crosses the B line, so right here. You would then get off and board the metro from the platform that says A line Revivia, and ride that metro through approximately 10 stops until you reach the Revivia stop right here. So once you ride the metro a couple of times, you'll start to get the hang of it. You might get lost every now and then, but that's what people are for, and you can always ask questions. If you determine that you got on the platform and you're going in the wrong direction, don't panic. Just get off at the next stop, change platforms, and reboard. You will then be going back to where you just came from. This is generally the same concept for a bus or a tram. If you're going in the wrong direction, you can just get off, cross the street, and get on the bus or tram going in the opposite direction. And finally, I'm going to try to briefly touch on all the things you need to think about when going on a weekend trip. These will include your classes, research, the necessary documentation, transportation, where to stay. Throughout these next couple of slides, I'll also include some resources I found useful during my time abroad, as well as additional information and resources provided by other students and EPAs. So obviously, don't forget why you're abroad and keep your classes in mind when you're planning weekend trips. Make sure you know the attendance and makeup policies of each of your professors and communicate with them should you have to miss a class. Classes work a lot like they do here, and at many universities, the rules are sometimes even more strict than they are here. For example, because I was in an intensive language program, missing 2 or 3 days of class would have dropped my grade an entire letter. So just be aware of these things while you're planning. Additionally, don't forget to look at your university's academic calendar for any breaks or days off you may have, as well as for your final schedule. This will help you figure out the best times to plan weekend or day trips. So it may sound obvious, but some students don't think about the fact that you only have a set amount of time abroad, and it's definitely something you need to be mindful of before you go abroad. Are you going on a summer program that's just 4 weeks long, or are you going on a semester program that's 5 months long? We'll cover this in more detail in the budgeting abroad webinar, but I want to emphasize here that it's also important to realize that you'll likely also have a set amount of money for your time abroad. This will particularly affect how you plan weekend trips and you should take both time and money into account. If you're going on a shorter program and you also want to travel to other countries or cities while you're there, you may want to consider planning some of those trips now before you leave. Things such as food, souvenirs, and particularly transportation and living accommodations are more expensive during the summer months, so tickets and reservations will likely be more affordable the further in advance you purchase them. Longer programs, on the other hand, allow for some more spontaneity, and in fact, I would recommend waiting to book any weekend trips until you spend a week or two in your host country. You'll likely meet other students in your program or university that will share common travel interests, and you may find out about an opportunity you didn't know about previously that you'd like to participate in. Long story short, have a general idea about how much you want to travel in relation to how much time you have, as well as how much money you have. Knowing this allows you to have more realistic expectations of traveling abroad during your program according to your personal preferences as well as your budget. Also, make a list of the things or places you really want to see while you're abroad so you can keep that in mind when you're planning weekend trips. That is a perfect segue into how to do research for weekend trips. As I'm sure you've already figured out, if you've started to do some research on your host country, there is a plethora of information online, and it can be a little overwhelming at times. I've included some more specific resources at the end of this presentation, but I would recommend starting with some of the resources I've listed here when trying to figure out where you want to travel. Personally, I use Pinterest for most of my research. You can find so much information about sightseeing opportunities in a particular city, essential apps to have when studying abroad, suggested packing lists, museums that offer free entry with a student ID, or restaurants to visit. There are also so many travel apps out there, so do a little research to find the ones that will best address your personal needs while abroad. Message boards or blogs are also a great place to go, particularly because you can often find ones that are country-specific and could assist in providing suggestions for a weekend trip. Referring to travel books may help you find places you never knew about. And finally, don't forget to ask any on-site staff or local students you meet, as they often have some of the best suggestions. Whenever you leave your host country, you must have your original travel documents, including your passport and visa. If you are asked to present these upon re-entry into your host country, a copy by itself would not be enough. You should, however, bring a set of copies with you in addition to the originals and leave a set of copies at home, either in your host home, apartment, or dorm room. It would also be a good idea to bring your host university acceptance letter, program details, and any documentations for prescription medication you'll be carrying, just in case you're ever asked for it. You will definitely be asked to present these documents when traveling out of the country via plane. If you're crossing country borders via train or bus, they may not be checked. However, it is always a good idea to bring them anyways, just in case, because you never know. Additionally, you may not have needed to apply for a visa to get into your host country. Even if you did, that visa is only good for your host country. When traveling on the weekends, depending on the country, you may need a tourist visa to enter, and you will be turned away without one. Some of these countries include Russia, China, India, Egypt, Venezuela, and Brazil. You can find a complete list of these countries on the U.S. State Department website. There are many options for traveling between countries, and this is where I would suggest doing a lot of your own research, especially if you're looking for the most affordable option. One option is to travel by plane. The sites I listed here are great for searching for and comparing prices of flights with different airlines. You wouldn't believe how cheap these tickets can be, especially compared to flights within the US. Don't let that fool you though. A lot of these regional or budget airlines charge you for everything. Checking a bag, printing a ticket at the airport, failure to check in online ahead of time, using the restroom, choosing a seat. They're tricky, and those costs can really add up quickly, so just beware. Most of the time, though, this is the most affordable way to travel, especially when you compare price and travel time. I've listed some of the most commonly used regional and budget airlines by region in the resources at the end of this presentation. This leads me to another option, which is to travel by bus or train. Though tickets for these may be cheaper, the travel time is also much longer, maybe as many as 12 hours, and often through the night. You have to decide what is more valuable to you, money or time, and that might change depending on where you're going or how much time you have. Trains and buses can also be a fun way to see more of a country if that's something you're interested in, so keep that in mind too. Finally, depending on where you are, renting a car is also an option. Know that some companies might not allow individuals to rent on a student visa or have a minimum age limit. Also, be sure to check to see if your program has rules about renting cars, and be mindful of the fact that driving and traffic rules can be pretty different in other countries. It may not be something you want to risk, and there's almost always going to be a public transportation option. There are also some student travel companies that will plan day or weekend trips for you. Some of these include Weekend Student Adventures, Bus to Alps, and Student Uni Travel, which is in Australia. They might be slightly more expensive than what it would cost if you had planned all the details for yourself, but some are worth it, especially because they save you from having to spend that time planning. For example, my friends and I booked a reservation through a company called Viator for a day trip to the Strait of Gibraltar from Malaga. The price included a bus there and back, a tour guide, and a ticket into the underground caves, and it was definitely worth the money. Sometimes it's nice to let someone else take care of the details and just relax, but make sure you know what you're getting when you book. You also have a couple of different options when looking for places to stay for a weekend trip, but there are some things you should keep in mind. Regarding hostels, their quality will vary significantly, and in most cases, you'll be staying in a room with lots of bunk beds, like the picture you see here at the top left. There will also probably be community bathrooms and showers, so make sure you bring shower shoes. Hostels are generally the cheapest options, but you will likely have to figure out your own transportation there and back to the airport. Sometimes they will also provide breakfast or another small meal for a small additional fee. For Airbnbs, you have to make an account online in order to search and apply for options. For some, you can rent an entire house during your stay, but most likely you want to be looking for people who are renting just a room of their house for a particular number of days. Some of these Airbnbs may be slightly more expensive than a hostel, but occasionally you may have a host who offers to pick you up and drop you off at the airport for a small additional charge, and some will even offer to show you around their city. Don't count on this, though. This is also generally very safe because each host also has a profile on which people who stay with them can make comments and give ratings, so just make sure you really look into who and where you'll be staying. Keep in mind, too, that they can rate you on your profile as a guest as well, so just like you would here, respect the property where you stay because you can be rejected by hosts in the future based on reviews that people give you. These people are willingly allowing strangers from all over the world to stay in their home for an affordable price. It's also a really great way to get to know lots of cool people. Obviously, hotels are always an option, but they are certainly the most expensive in most cases. And finally, couch surfing is very similar to Airbnbs, but not as widely used and don't usually provide the small luxuries you get in a hostel or Airbnb. People will basically allow you to stay on their couch for free. Like Airbnbs, you and the host must both have accounts on the couch surfing website and make arrangements beforehand. Be sure to do your research and read ratings about the host, as they are not as closely regulated or established as the ones through Airbnb. You also may not necessarily know what you're getting, or in other words, they may not allow you to shower or use the kitchen. I never used couch surfing, but I had a couple of friends who did and had positive experiences for the most part. I would say that hostels and Airbnbs will probably be your best bet, as they are most widely used and affordable, but hotels and couch surfing are also okay options. If your program is through a UK partner, such as ISA, Arcadia, Teen, or Soul, many will require you to notify your on-site staff of your travel plans anytime you leave your host city. If you're not on a partner program and don't have any on-site staff to notify, at least tell your parents or a close friend back at home if at all possible. This is important in case there's some type of emergency because it makes you easier to locate. Also, I know you've probably heard plenty of people talk about pickpocketing. You'd be amazed at how skilled some of these pickpocketers can be. However, there are ways to protect yourself from it. Make sure that you're always aware of where your belongings are and of the people around you. Pickpockets are more prevalent on public transportation and in crowded areas, so it might be best to hold your backpack in front of you as opposed to on your back when you're standing in a busy metro. For females, I would suggest investing in a crossbody purse with a good zipper. Keep in mind that you still won't be pickpocket-proof this way, so you still need to be aware of it at all times. For males, you may not want to put your wallet in your back pocket and instead consider your front pocket or a zipper pouch that can be clipped underneath your clothing. Additionally, though it's sometimes fun to travel in large groups, you'll find that this will be difficult to coordinate for a weekend trip, and it's probably better to travel in small groups of 2 to 4 people anyway. Also, I would strongly suggest learning or writing down a few of the basic phrases in the native language that's spoken where you'll be traveling to. This will help you maneuver through the city better and ask for help if you need it. Simple phrases such as, "Can you help me?" "Where is?" "Thank you," or "How much?" can go a long way in an unfamiliar language, and people are generally very willing to help if you just ask. Finally, maybe you'd rather travel solo, or maybe you can't find anyone to go somewhere you really want to visit. Don't be afraid to consider solo travel, as many students do while they're abroad. I didn't, but I really wish I would have, as some of my friends had really positive experiences. Traveling solo really helps you learn a lot about yourself and about how to be independent. In some ways, it's also easier because you don't have to worry about the logistics of planning a trip for 2 people, and you get to make all of the decisions yourself. When and where you want to eat, when you want to stop for a cup of coffee, what you'll want to see. It really allows you a lot more freedom, but there are some things you should think about. Know that a solo trip will likely be more expensive, as you won't have someone else to split the cost with. Also, be smart, especially in regards to your safety, but don't let that stop you from capitalizing on desired opportunities. This would mean planning your transportation and lodging carefully and ahead of time. A bunk in a hostel might be cheaper and will most likely be completely safe, but if you feel more comfortable, you might prefer your own room in an Airbnb. If you go out exploring at night, know how you'll be getting home. Taxis are always a good option and affordable, particularly if you're only going a relatively short distance. Always watch whatever belongings you have with you carefully. Be careful who you tell where you're staying, and if you're of drinking age, it would be best to stay sober. Since you won't have someone else to talk about certain situations with, trust your gut, and if something doesn't feel right, listen to that. Most of all, have fun and use this as an opportunity to get to know the locals where you're visiting. Don't be afraid to ask people questions and put yourself out there. Oftentimes, you will make many unsuspecting friends who will likely have the best suggestions for ways to spend your time in that city. All in all, you really need to determine what you're comfortable with. If the idea of traveling solo makes you nervous, then maybe it's best for you to travel in a group because you might not have as much fun on a solo trip. If you're really independent and traveling solo sounds fun, don't be afraid to plan solo trips for yourself. In the resources at the end of this presentation, I've included a couple of blogs and websites I found that have good tips for traveling solo. I would recommend looking through these as well as any other blogs you find online to determine if traveling solo is something you would be comfortable with. It takes a lot more planning than you would think to organize a weekend trip, so start planning early if you can, especially if you're wanting to go with a couple of friends from your program or university. You'll be thankful you put time into planning out the logistics when you feel like you got your money's worth out of your experience and did so fairly effortlessly. Now, I'm not saying you need to have every minute of your trip planned out, but at least have a good idea of how you're going to get from the airport to your lodging, what you want to see, how you're going to get to those places, what museums or attractions offer free entry to students, and maybe some recommended restaurants. You can always change your plans when you get there if you find out about something else you didn't know about beforehand, but at least you go having a tentative plan, especially when you don't know where you'll be able to find free, reliable Wi-Fi once you get to your destination. I can speak from experience here. I went with my roommate on a spontaneous weekend trip to Switzerland, and by spontaneous, I mean we bought the plane tickets maybe 3 days in advance. As a result, we didn't really have much time to plan, and that was obvious when we arrived in Zurich around 11 o'clock at night and got lost trying to find our way to our Airbnb. We also weren't prepared for the prices in Switzerland. Side note, Switzerland is very expensive, so we pretty much ended up walking around Zurich for 2 days and didn't really see much. We did take a bus trip to the Alps one day, which was totally worth it, but if I'd done it over again, I would have planned further in advance, so I knew about some specific things that I wanted to spend my money on. Spontaneity can be really fun sometimes, so I'm not saying not to plan spontaneous trips, but realize you might have more fun if you plan a little ahead of time. So, when you're planning a weekend trip, start by selecting a date that works best for you, research some options for destinations using the resources I discussed earlier, and choose a final destination. Then, work on booking transportation and lodging. One advantage of starting this process early is that you have some time to watch the prices for these things. Oftentimes, plane ticket prices will fluctuate and suddenly drop one day and then go back up the next. Sitting on them and watching for these drops in prices may help you get the cheapest price. Prices for bus and train tickets don't really fluctuate, so you can usually purchase those as early as you'd like. Next is the fun part. Create a list of possible must-sees, popular restaurants, and museums in your destination. It may be helpful to have a notebook with these lists along with the addresses for each place so that when you get there, you can find them more easily. Finally, you want to plan how you're going to get to the airport, bus, or train station in your host city, how you're going to get from the airport to your lodging at your final destination, and what you're going to pack. Our Packing Abroad webinar next week will cover how to pack for a weekend trip. Make sure when you're planning, you at least have an idea of your budget for the entire trip. This also helps you have a better, more realistic idea of how many sites or meals out that you can afford when also taking the price for transportation and lodging into account. There are some traveling differences you should be aware of if you'll be studying abroad in a host country outside of Europe. Depending on where you are, the most prevalent mode of transportation will likely vary, and I've listed the most widely used modes by region here. Know that generally there's a further distance between locations in these regions, which will cause an increase in travel time. Be mindful of this when planning weekend or other trips. Additionally, trams and trains are not as prevalent outside of Europe and Asia. Though they do exist, flying or catching the bus may be the best mode of transportation for you. I would suggest asking someone who's previously been to your host country or locals and other students in your program upon arrival to see what they suggest. All right, so that's all I've got for now. I've included some links in the next couple of slides that myself and other students have found useful during their time abroad. Don't worry about trying to copy all of these down. We'll be sending out a PDF document of this presentation that includes these links and resources along with a recording of this webinar. These are just some of the websites you can use to research different destinations for weekend or other trips. Here are some of the most widely used regional and budget airlines by region. I've also included the sites you can use for comparing ticket prices. These are the student travel companies that I mentioned earlier. And the links for the lodging options I talked about. Keep in mind that these are not the only websites to find hostels or hotels. Google will also be helpful in searching for these. Finally, here are some useful travel apps we've seen used by many students, and I've kind of separated them by purpose. We've got some travel planning, some translation apps, some navigation apps, and then some lodging apps. So those will be really helpful, and that there are definitely a lot more. So do some more research on those. So my biggest piece of advice, though, would be to ask someone who's already been to your host country for some recommendations for all of these things. If you don't know anybody, email our office and we can try to connect you to an EPA or another student that has previously been to your host country. They will be able to offer the most country-specific advice. Thanks again for tuning in. I hope this helped give you some motivation to finish this semester so that you can go abroad already. Good luck on finals.